Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, The Need for Electric Grid Transformation. My name is Glenn Anderson. I am the Energy Program Director at NCSL, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. This webinar is one of NCSL's Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee's 2019 Spring Webinar Series, which featured 6 webinars. This is the final of that series. Those webinars covered carbon capture and storage technologies, traffic safety injury prevention strategies, the future of plastics, and the regulatory and legislative landscape of cell-cultured meat. View the recordings of those webinars and see the PowerPoint slides. Please visit our website at www.ncsl.org. So today's webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement. Over the next hour, we encourage participation through our chat box, so feel free to type your questions and answer any questions in the chat box, which is in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. We will be holding a formal Q&A after both presenters are finished presenting. The webinar today is being recorded, and the registrants will be able to access the recording of the webinar and the presentation slides on NCSL's website after the webinar wraps. Additionally, you'll be able to download the presentation slides being used for today's webinar by clicking on the Resources tab, and speaker bios as well by clicking on the Speaker tab at any time during the presentation. Today's webinar explores how states are creating new regulatory and policy approaches to incorporate a variety of emerging technologies in order to modernize the electric grid. There has been a tremendous amount of activity within state legislatures and utility commissions as they craft ways to incorporate new technologies, address changing consumer preferences, and ensure reliability. This webinar will explore the major elements of grid modernization, and speakers will discuss the policies that are shaping the future of the nation's electric grid. With that, I want to introduce our first presenter, Steve Hauser. Steve is the CEO of the GridWise Alliance, a national industry-led organization that promotes the modernization of the nation's electricity infrastructure. He is a nationally and internationally recognized expert on transforming the power sector to meet future economic, environmental, and energy security mandates. So, Steve, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Glenn. And I'm very pleased to join you and everybody on the phone today to discuss this very important topic. I've worked with NCSL over many years, and in working with them and legislators and your staff across the country, I've always found that you're eager to learn, you ask good questions, and you understand these very complex issues, and my hats are off to you for doing so. My goal today is to just give you a framework to understand the issues that are facing our grids, and I use that plural purposely. I'm not going to be able to answer all your questions today in the short time we have, but I'm very happy to connect with you offline, either directly, I'll give my email at the end of the presentation, or through Glenn or any of his team. So I'll talk just briefly about the GridWise Alliance. We've been around for more than 15 years now. We're a nonprofit. We include a lot of organizations that are really focused on leading the changes that are happening across the grid, and we've been doing so for all these many years. GridWise uses our diverse membership to develop new policy and regulatory ideas and principles that really help to represent the entire ecosystem, and you'll hear a little bit more about that as I go. We certainly work closely with stakeholders like state legislators to help you understand what is changing in the industry, what's about to change in the industry, how this evolution, and some call it transformation, is taking place. We monitor the pulse of what's happening at the federal legislative level as well as at the state level. And as I'm sure you all know, it takes a mixture of all that. Let me define the grid real quickly, which is, from our perspective, the grid represents everything that connects the sources of energy to the uses of energy. So you think about power plants for sure, but you think about rooftop solar systems and wind farms and other things that are going to supply electricity to the grid, all the way down to devices that use electricity at industrial, commercial, and residential sites. And all that infrastructure that does that is part of the grid from our perspective. This is just a slide that shows you some of our members, that it sort of underscores the fact we represent IOUs, utilities, public utilities, as well as large technology companies and several innovative new startup technology companies as well as part of the ecosystem. And oftentimes we engage beyond just our membership to make sure that we get a diversity of viewpoints and opinions in the things we do. You know, when we talk about the changing grid to meet the future needs of the system, I'm sure you've all heard, as I have, the term smart grid, modern grid, future grid, probably other things that refer to this topic we're talking about today. Increasingly over the last couple of years, we've talked about decentralized, decarbonized, digitized grid. I hear that quite often these days. I've kind of boiled that all down, and I've started to talk over the last couple of years about a highly networked, highly optimized grid to try to get around kind of the pious platitudes, if you will. And highly networked, of course, from an electricity standpoint, the grid's been highly networked for 100 years, but it's increasingly being highly networked from an IT information standpoint, and that's really what I mean by looking at the future. And highly optimized is really looking at all the opportunities for improving how the grid performs, both from a customer standpoint, from a cost standpoint, from a policy standpoint, from a state and local perspective as well. I often get asked, so what is the modern grid? What is the smart grid? What is the future grid? I often hear policymakers, I won't accuse anybody in particular, but I hear people say, look, no one really understands what a smart grid is. It's like it's very diverse. It's very hard to get your head around. I often point to this, which hopefully all of you have already read and you're familiar with this, but we actually have a federal policy on what a smart grid is and what a modern grid is. This comes from the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, so it's a little over a decade old now. But if you haven't read it, you should read it, and I can provide a copy to Glenn or anybody that wants to contact me directly. I have a readable version, so you don't have to sort through all the legislative language. But this is actually the first section of that title, which says it is the policy of the United States to support the modernization of the nation's electricity transmission and distribution system. So there is a policy, there's a national policy, it exists, and it describes in this first section some of the features that were viewed back 10 years ago. This probably needs to be updated. But then the Title 13 goes on to specify a number of different things that have happened, including demonstration projects, which have been part of the ARRA funds, Smart Grid grants, which some of you I'm sure are familiar with, because those happened across the country in many cities and states across the country. But it is worth going back and looking at this. It's not a concept that is not hard to understand. It actually is spelled out pretty clearly in federal legislation, And of course, many of your states have either used this as a basis or have developed your own definition for what you view as a smart or modern grid is. We at the GridWise Alliance try to sort of boil this all down to provide thought leadership to the industry. And when I say the industry, I'm not talking about just the vendors and the utilities. I'm talking about all of the stakeholders, the mayors, the governors, the regulators, the state legislators. We really try to provide that information back to you in a usable form. These are 3 examples of reports that we've done over the last few years. There's several others on our website. I encourage you to go to our website and look there to find those resources, which hopefully you would find useful. So let me kind of talk about it a little bit more, which is the electricity industry is clearly changing. Technology innovation is driving that. We hear about those kinds of things a lot in the news. I'm sure you do too. It seems like every week or almost literally every day, we hear of a new technology innovation. It's a new electric vehicle, it's a new battery, it's a new solar rooftop system or whatever, a new software system, a new consumer engagement system, a new app, if you will. Competitive markets are also driving the change, and I'm sure, again, you've heard a lot about the reduction in costs of some of these technologies, solar, storage, wind. The costs have come down pretty rapidly over the last few years, which is driving market opportunities, and that in turn drives change in the industry. And these changes require us to look again at our policies and our regulations to make sure that they're in line with the changes that are happening, both from technology and the market standpoint. And of course, as you know, as well as anybody, our concern remains public health, safety, and economic vitality, if you will, or productivity are extremely important. I tend to lump the benefits. So what we have to be careful of is not to look specifically at technology benefits, right? And what we have to look at is whole system benefits and how these all work together to create benefits throughout the system for consumers writ large and the economy writ large, if you will. So the 5 things I put on the right side are more efficient use of capital assets. So this is a very capital intensive infrastructure, the grid is, and we have to look for ways to make sure we're using the grid as effectively and efficiently as possible and to minimize the amount of capital that's required to provide our needs. We've increasingly looking at reliability, and I want to say unique consumer demands, right? So the demands for reliability for consumers in Florida or in Tornado Alley up through Mississippi and Tennessee, those reliability concerns are very different from those in, let's say, the Rocky Mountain Range where I'm located, and I know Glenn's located, because Fort Collins doesn't look at reliability the same way. It turns out Fort Collins, as a municipal utility, decided years ago to underground their distribution system, and storms don't bother them. Flooding does sometimes, you have to be a little careful there, but they look at reliability very differently. Likewise, productivity, we need to look for how do we get more out of the system, less energy consistent for a higher productivity, more efficient and transparent grid operations, and of course, greater flexibility, and this is increasingly an issue, more flexibility to accommodate clean generation technologies and clean consumption technologies, right? So electric vehicles are sort of the flagship on the consumption side, and rooftop solar or solar farms, wind farms are the flagship on the generation side. I want to talk just for a few minutes about one of the reports that we put out that's available on our website. And again, I can provide this to Glenn if you want to access it via his organization. But it's called the Grid Modernization Index. This is the 5th year that we did it. We published it back in December. And I just want to talk real briefly about that because it sort of summarizes what's going on around the country. what we do with the GMI is collect data that's publicly available. We reach out to utilities, regulators, other organizations within state to try to get the best available data we can. We look at EIA data and other things as sources for our analysis as well. We produced the first report back in 2013, and so like I said, this is the fifth report. It's become pretty widely recognized. Many of you have probably seen it or looked at it. We score each state as best we can on a scale of 1 to 100, where we look at state support, which is sort of what policies are in place to help drive grid modernization in that particular state. We look at customer engagement, how well the policies, how well the practices by utilities are engaging customers. And then we look at grid operations, how efficient, what kind of technologies are being deployed, and so on. And we look at, something like 75 or 80 different factors when we evaluate this score. So it's not just a, put your finger in the air and try to guess at what the score is, but we base it on a lot of data that's available. So here's the result. You probably can't see that very well, so I encourage you to download the report and look through it yourself. There's a lot of really good information there. So here was the ranking this last year of all 50 states. And we this year tried to group them into what I'll call clusters. So the top two states, California and Illinois, have clearly been leaders in this space for many years. And so they've ranked high in almost every index that we've done. The second group we call the movers, which are states that have been very active for a number of years. We call the orange group the believers. These are states that a lot of them are relatively new, or they're introducing new things in their states actively as in recent years. And the orange group are states that are just kind of getting started in this. I will say the white states, and there's about 12 or 15 white states, those are just states that we weren't able to get data from for 2018. And so we've actually started to talk to a few of those states to try to update their scores this year, and try to make sure we're getting the right data from them. So the one thing I'll say sort of overall is, if you can see the scores, there's about 40 states. Number 11, I can't see it very well myself, but there's about 40 of the 50 states that are scoring below 50. So there's only 10 that are scoring between 50 and 100. So there's a lot of room here to grow, right? There's a lot that still has to be done, and we talk about a lot of that in the report. I'm not going to go into details here in the interest of time, but you're welcome to look at these, just sort of some of the characteristics of the different clusters of states. And then I've included some specifics that, again, some of you have probably seen much of this, but I've included 2 states in each group and some specific bullets around each of those states that hopefully will help you understand why they're grouped in the group they're in. So Arizona and Maryland have done some pretty innovative things in their states. Colorado and Rhode Island are kind of the next tier down. Now, some of these states are doing a lot this year, and Colorado is a good example of, with a new governor coming in January, the legislature in Colorado has already passed a whole suite of smart grid, modern grid, clean grid provisions in the last month or so, and we'll be featuring those in our report that's coming out this year. So key takeaways, and then I'll kind of wrap up and turn it over to Beth. From a policy standpoint, I don't think any of these will surprise you. Storage is starting to be a much more popular policy issue in a number of states than it was maybe a couple of years ago. it's going to be a very important factor going forward for lots of different reasons. States are starting to look at a more holistic approach, which we support. We think that's really important, to look more holistically as opposed to pass policies that are technology focused, which is what's kind of happened in the past. Now we're looking at more holistic approaches, which I think are really good. Some states are starting to look at this idea of a platform, creating a platform for engaging both on the market side as well as on the consumer side, and we think that's going to be a new trend going forward. And of course, we don't want to forget public utilities. Well, public utilities represent around 25% or so of the customers in the country. They also, there's a lot of them, right? As I'm sure you all know, there's probably more than 2,500 public utilities across the country. They tend to be a lot smaller, but some of them can be very, very innovative. And I mentioned Fort Collins earlier. You can think Chattanooga, Tennessee as being very innovative, Sacramento in California, Austin in Texas, and I could go on and on. There's a number of them probably in your state, and you can point to them as being innovators. In the customer engagement area, data is becoming king. Data is becoming extremely important. Privacy is becoming an issue that has to be dealt with from a policy standpoint, as I'm sure you're all aware. And on the operations side, we're starting to focus much more on distribution planning and distribution systems and how those are dealt with, as well as cybersecurity, of course, is becoming an issue. In 2019, our GMI activity will be focused a little bit differently on some examples of best practices that are taking place across the country. We're not going to rescore all 50 states this year because things just don't change that fast. So we'll probably rescore some states where we know there's been a lot of changes, and we'll kind of feature those states in this year's report. And then in 2020, we'll do a full rescoring of all 50 states. And then in the transition to our next speaker, from Commissioner from Ohio, we chose to give 4 awards this past year as a result of our GMI analysis and report. We gave leadership awards to California and Illinois. I kind of mentioned that earlier. And then we gave sort of most improved, if you will, or outstanding progress awards to both Ohio and Rhode Island because of all the progress that they've made within their state just over the last couple of years. And Beth is going to talk a lot more about what's going on in Ohio. So I'm going to end by saying, you know, it's not enough to focus on technologies. It's not enough to focus on markets. It's not enough to focus just on policies. We have to look at how those work together to come up with a real valuable or strategic plan for each of your states to change the grid, and it's really critical that we get out in front of that, and I know many of you are already. I'll end by just inviting you to our conference that we do in December. Grid Connects 2019 is in December. You can look on our website or look on the gridconnects.com website and get more information about that. And with that, I'll end and turn it over to Glenn. Do you want to introduce our next speaker?
Yeah, thanks so much, Steve. That was an excellent overview. Just kind of touching the surface of a very complex topic, of course, but just to note that we will be able to provide, you know, if you want to contact us, we can provide links. Also, you should be able to access those through the links provided by Steve as well to take a look at that Grid Modernization Index, which I think is a really valuable and useful tool. So just a reminder, we are taking audience questions, so please enter your questions at any time in the audience chat box. We will address those after our next speaker. Our speakers would be very happy to answer any questions you may have on this topic. So next up, we have Commissioner Beth Trombold, who has served as Vice Chair of the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. and I believe she was became a commissioner in 2013. Commissioner has focused extensively on grid modernization and regional electric transmission issues, and is past president of the organization of PJM States Incorporated, an organization of 14 state commissions in the service area of PJM, the regional transmission operator. So with that, let's welcome Commissioner Trombold.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn. I appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me here today. You know, talking on these webinars are great in terms of getting a lot of people together, but they're also hard for someone like me as a speaker because I really like to look at my audience. So I might say some things just to entertain myself, if nothing else, during this conversation. So please ask questions at the end. I really want to hear if anyone has questions about my presentation or other things about grid modernization. It's something that I've worked on quite a bit over the last couple years. As Glenn mentioned, I'm one of 5 commissioners appointed by the Governor of Ohio, and I serve a 5-year term. I'm currently in the 2nd year of my term, and for the last couple of years, I have looked at grid modernization. I want to talk to you a little bit today about what is grid modernization, and I know Steve did a great job kind of teeing it up, and then also talk a lot about what Ohio's been doing, and if perhaps there might be some things or best practices you could look at or take from what we've experienced or what we've learned during our education in order for your state to maybe benefit. So just to get started, I'm going to talk about what is grid modernization, and I know Steve talked about it as well. It's kind of a nebulous term. It really encompasses a lot of things, and it means a lot of different things to different people. So if someone comes up to you and starts talking about it, you might want to ask that simple question: what do you exactly mean by grid modernization? That is not a stupid question because, like I said, it can mean many things to different people. But for our purposes today, grid modernization is creating a platform. So if you think of it like a stage that integrates and optimizes new technology. So it's a stage that can accommodate lots of different things. It kind of looks to the future and is very universal in the way it can be used. And it can integrate and optimize distributive energy resources on the grid. And we can talk more about those. I don't want to hijack the conversation with a lot of tech terms, but I'm happy to dive deeper if you'd like. So power forward. So what Ohio realized was that we really needed to have a discussion by our commissioners about grid modernization because we were going to be seeing some filings before us, and we really didn't feel like we were very equipped or had the expertise to deal with them. And so what we decided to do was have a educational process to talk about grid modernization. And like it says here on my slide, the traditional one-way grid is being transformed into an intelligent multi-directional grid for data and all sorts of things. People are thinking about using their phone as a way to do lots of things like banking. I mean, most people these days utilize their phone and apps for many things for their everyday life, but do you really use it to look at your electric usage or pay your electric bill or monitor or shut things off? Those things are starting to be in their infancy, and we want to make sure that going down this pathway that we as a commission were equipped with the tools and the knowledge base to know what we needed to do as policymakers to allow some of this innovation to occur. So even with smart vehicles or electric vehicles coming down the pike too, these are all impacting the grid, the system as a whole, and we want to make sure that, you know, we have that in mind as we move forward. So Power Forward came about, and I say this kind of in jest, but we wanted to name this conversation so it would have an easy discussion. So what is it you're talking about? We didn't want to call it the Grid Mod for Ohio because we weren't sure people would understand that. So we came up with this term, Power Forward. And incidentally, it was during March Madness, and incidentally, LeBron James is a big basketball player here in Ohio, and incidentally, I did not know that Power Forward was a thing in basketball. I am a soccer mom. I did not realize this, but our group came together and came up with this term Power Forward, to which lots of people laughed afterwards and thought that we were kind of incorporating the March Madness into this discussion, and that was not the case. So whatever you want to think about it, if it helps you remember Ohio Power Forward Grid Mod, so be it. But we kind of like that term because it seems like a good one and it's stuck. But what we decided to do with Power Forward was talk about how innovation, both technological and regulatory innovation, could enhance the customer experience. So we wanted to create this whole discussion around the customer. As a commission, if we're going to have grid modernization or various things regarding grid mod impact the customer and customer bills, we want to make sure it benefits them in some way. Otherwise, why are we having this conversation? At the end of the day, the customer is usually the ones that pay for it, and we want to make sure it's something they want, something they're benefiting from, and something that the commission can help facilitate. So what we did was we came up with some principles and objectives, and these were real basic things. Like I said, look here, do no harm, create net value, create an innovative environment, enhance the experience for all. These are pretty basic things that most commissions, I think, universally would want to have in order to, before they start any kind of proceeding. And our objective was really to think about having a strong grid. We were told during these conversations, you have to have a strong grid before you have a smart grid, making sure that the basics were done. Before you start overlaying more complicated things on top of the grid, you better make sure it's ready for it. Like I said before, the grid as a platform, making sure that platform, that stage, if you will, was strong enough to support anything that would be put onto it. And Ohio is a choice state, so we have retail electric choice where you can choose your electric provider who, those electrons that come to your house, you can choose who provides them. And we wanted to make sure there was a robust marketplace and obviously the customer again. So if you look at it, we put together an educational program that was divided into 3 phases. And it doesn't look like 3 phases here because we have the roadmap at the end, but the top of it, you can see the first 3 are the first 3 phases. And the first phase we called the glimpse of the future. So this kind of created the business case for grid modernization discussions. Why were we talking about this? What's going on in the environment? There's all this change in technology, lots of things going on. Ratepayers of the future are going to be the people graduating from college and high school, and those people don't know a world without the internet. So how is this marketplace, this electric universe that we live in going to be affected by that? And what kinds of things do we need to prepare for as we go down that path? So we started off talking a lot about that. Then we moved on and we kind of developed it in a funnel type of approach. So you see a really broad discussion narrowing as we went through it. And we did this over a 2-year time period. As you can see, we would have phase 1, then we'd wait several days. Over several days, we'd wait a couple months, incorporate what we learned into the phase 2. We'd meet for 3 days. Now these were all-day kind of sessions. We looked at what other commissions were doing across the country, and we decided this was the best use of our time, where we could really concentrate on these issues for a couple days at a time, but we had to maintain our work schedules. We had to keep going in our own regulatory lives, if you will, and we wanted to make sure we could do that and still devote the time required to understand these issues. So that's why we spread it out over a period of time. We looked at what some states did. Some states did it once a month. Some states did it very ad hoc. And some states did it more organized the way we did. But we kind of are the only ones that I think handled it quite this way. And what we also did, I didn't mention before, is our commission was not mandated by the legislature to do this, to have this conversation, or the governor. We kind of initiated it organically on our own. We didn't have a budget for it. We held these meetings in our commission offices where we conduct our meetings. We didn't pay a lot of money for any of this, but the conversation, I think, was so important and worth all the money in the world because These people came from all over the country to educate us free of charge. It's amazing what people are willing to do when you want to listen and you really want to be thoughtful about making policy changes. So just moving along, we had phase 3, rate making, or phase 2 was exploring technology. So we explored a lot of the tech and got a little more technical in nature. And as we kind of moved down that funnel, we talked about rate making and regulation, which really gets technical quickly. As you can see in those bullet points on the side there, we had 127 speakers that spoke during this 3 phases. We had 100 hours of education, 2,000 downloads. We had videos, social media. We webcasted all of our phases. You can go look at any of them you'd like with the presentations, the speakers we used, and whatnot. We just wanted to make it very transparent, the process. We wanted to engage anyone who could come to our office to come or watch it online. We used to kiddingly say all of our millions of users out there watching us during these presentations. In actuality, there was probably upwards of several hundred on the line. But for a webcast, I think that was pretty impressive that people would want to take the time and listen in on what we were talking about, the questions we were asking, and the experts in the field that were there talking about various topics. Next up, the components of the report. So as we went through all of the phases, all 5 commissioners were at every phase, every day of each phase. We all worked on putting together the report. We actually all wrote part of the report, which if you know your commissions well, I mean, that doesn't always happen that commissioners are that engaged and able to sit through 8 hours a day of testimony and discussion on something like this, but it was really important, and we viewed it all as an important thing for us to do as a group. There weren't any kind of sunshine concerns or ex parte concerns because we did it in the public. We had our discussions in the public, and this was not a docketed proceeding, so we didn't have ex parte problems with that, and we were all able to talk amongst ourselves in the public on all this. So it was a great way for all of us as commissioners to kind of talk about what we saw, what we had questions about, and how we looked at the future. Now, the components of the report, we took several months to actually put together this report. We wanted to make it a readable report. If you get a copy of it, and I have the link to download it if you want to take a peek, we have lots of charts, graphs. We made it less than 28 pages of actual readable text. We had lots of information in there and definitions on things. So again, wanting to make it as helpful to legislators, to members of the public, to anyone who wanted to understand what it was we were doing here at the Commission and why. But some of the components in the report include, as I've said before, this notion of grid as a platform, the grid architecture. So what are all the pieces, the really nitty-gritty pieces that could be part of this modernized grid to make things cheaper, better for customers? We heard a lot about, customers want, I'd like to think they have perfect power, that 24/7, never breaks down, never is cut out of their service. And that's something that people really depend on, right? Everything we have is so electronically dependent. And so if there's ways for the grid to have sensors or various components put on it for companies to triangulate how to get that grid up and running faster, I think that's pretty important to customers and reliability. And so depending upon the cost, and for minimal cost, if a customer could see a minimal cost adder and see the grid being more operational more quickly and the reliability increase, I think they're kind of interested in that. We talked a lot about the consumers out there, and there's lots of consumers that really aren't interested in anything other than paying their bill each month and ensuring that the costs are low as possible. But there's some customers that have different views on it. There's that customer who really wants the green, wants things to be green and wants to pay a little bit more for that. There's customers who really are tech savvy and then really want to utilize the system in order to save money when they're not home. And there's customers that are changing their views on it as this technology becomes available. So all of those things we're looking at and taking into consideration. So I listed a lot of things. We also talked about cybersecurity. So this is a biggie. You may have heard it in your legislatures. I'm sure you hear it all the time. People are concerned about their information being made public. They're concerned about somebody getting in the system and tampering with it and creating a problem. And so that's something we're really interested in as we move towards this more advanced grid and making sure that systems and companies out there are equipped and also thinking about ways to curtail or ways to minimize the impact of cybersecurity or breaches or physical security breaches. It's very difficult to totally shut them down, but ways to keep it so that they can't get very far and minimize the impacts. So, you know, those are things we talked about very seriously during our Power Forward discussions. And then I just forwarded, you can download a copy, it's available. And like I said, it's a very readable format, or like we like to say it is. We tried to keep it as readable as possible, and I encourage you to take a peek at that. If your commissions, I'm sure, I've talked about it a lot in public utility venues with lots of commissions across the country. I'm sure some of your commissions might be familiar with it as well. So the role of the commission, again, I touched upon this a little bit. Again, this was commission-led initiative. There was no legislative directive. Some states did get a legislative directive to do this. The report that we put together is a roadmap for future discussions. It's not binding. It doesn't have any mandates. It's just sort of like giving people or companies guidance. So when they file something here at the Commission, they have a good sense of where we are and what we are interested in seeing for Ohio. Ohio is situated in the Midwest. We are not California. We're not New York. We're not Hawaii. Those are very different states and have done a lot of cutting-edge type of things. I like to say we like to sit back and look at what other states have done, learn from it, and utilize their best practices before moving forward. And that's kind of what we've been doing. And here, this slide just talks about the potential role of the legislature. I mean, the commission here, we're a creature of statute. We understand this. We live within the confines of the statute. However, the legislature could really take a look at whether or not they want to direct a commission to talk about grid modernization, or whether the commission would do it informally. They could direct the commission to allow cost recovery for grid modernization expenditures, and they could outline what that means. And in a restructured state like Ohio, they can clarify what the market access issues would be. So we're really relying upon the marketplace and innovation to kind of drive a lot of these types of innovative ideas that could possibly come out of grid modernization and in the marketplace, and that customers could elect to pay more or not, or be engaged or not in these kinds of things. So where we are now, we are basically in some work groups that have been developed from the roadmap that are talking more strategically, and they're drilling down on a lot of these issues, primarily the planning of the grid, and then also the data associated with the grid and the access to it. So these work groups have been working for the past year, and they're going to have a report they're going to issue at the end of this year. In addition to that, I'm also working nationally with a lot of states and our national association, NARUC, kind of like NCSL, but for utility commissioners. And we are working on getting together and creating sort of a forum for the development of state-led pathways toward a more resilient, efficient, and affordable grid. And here's the 16 states I listed there. It's a 2-year effort. We're just starting it, and we hope to have some materials put together by the end of 2021 to help states move forward and have some best practices in this area. And lastly, just some takeaways. Some recurring themes can be found across states, but each jurisdiction is unique. So you'll hear a lot of the same terminology, but you'll have to decide for your state what the readiness is, what the willingness is, and what the education level is in your state to move forward in any kind of grid modernization activities. Also, state commissions, I hope you know, are a great resource for the legislature. We like to be helpful to our members. Here in Ohio, we talk with our members as much as we can in our governor's office, making sure they understand that we do have experts and tools and are here to answer policy questions and help in any way we can in that decision-making process. That's all I have. I also want to have a shout out to Steve and GridWise, because they did give us this lovely award that I was able to go pick up in DC for outstanding progress. I felt like I was winning the Academy Awards, and had to say thank you to everybody for this award. I have it right here in my hands. I have it on my desk, Steve. And we do appreciate the that honor, because we've worked really hard the last couple of years to really put us on the map and understand that Ohio, although we are not like usually the front and center state that moves forward in these kinds of things, we are moving forward, and we are a modernized state, and we do like to be involved and engaged and want to make sure that we're part of this discussion. So with that, I'll turn it back to Glenn and NCSL and be happy to answer any of your questions. Be sure to follow up with us if you have any questions individually. I'll be happy to talk with any state. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Trumbull. That was a really good overview of the grid efforts you've been involved in Ohio on grid modernization. And right now, we'd like to kind of shift gears here and go into the question and answer portion. We don't have a ton of time, but we hope we can get through all the questions here. So again, if you do have questions, feel free to enter them in the audience chat box, and we will hopefully get to those. If not, we can also get those answered over email. So with that, we do have a few questions here. The first one would be, if a study committee of state legislators is formed to address state energy policy, how should an investigation of smart grid issues be focused or articulated in its charge? For either speaker, I'm sure.
That sounds like a question for you, Glenn. I think Beth talked about it a little bit already, so I'll answer real briefly, and then Beth, let you respond. But yeah, I think there's a couple of key things from our perspective. One is to take a holistic view, make sure that you've really looked across all the related issues, which Power Forward did a great job of. And then I think the other thing is to look at the unique issues that are going on in your state. So don't try to copy other states. You might copy the process. I think the Power Forward process was certainly a good process, and you could look at that as a template for the process. But don't try to copy what's happened in other states, because what's going on in your state is unique to your state. Beth, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with you. So a study committee of state legislators, if it's formed, how should they investigate? Well, I mean, I think you should work real closely with your commission in order to bring in the right people that would benefit a discussion of this nature. I think you need to talk with them and take a look at what are the grid modernization issues that you need to tackle. Do you need to start out and really understand what it is, like kind of what the funnel approach, if you will, and then drill down? Are EVs suddenly becoming more and more utilized in your state, and what's going on with the EV situation? I know there's some legislation pending in Ohio about EVs and what? Okay. I'm talking with my aide because she knows more about it than I do. But I think that, it's different. You can piecemeal this, or you can look at it holistically. And it just depends what the appetite is, I think, for the legislature, for the states themselves, the commissions, if there's a particular issue that seems to be bubbling up, or if you want to really tackle it holistically. So I guess you have to take a look at that. And then I see in the next question, how were state legislators involved in the Ohio process? And that's a really good question. I probably should have mentioned this too. We met with the chairs of the relevant committees in the legislature prior to Power Forward beginning. We wanted to engage with them and tell them what we were working on. We invited them to our Power Forward discussions. And I don't know that there was a huge participation. There was a lot going on at the State House at the time. They were obviously busy with other things, which was totally fine. We shared with them our roadmap. We shared with our governor's office the roadmap. We kept them in the loop every step of the way. We also engaged with lots of stakeholders during the process and before Power Forward began. We met, the chairman at the time and I went around the state and met with each CEO of our distribution electric utilities. We didn't want to surprise anyone with this discussion. We didn't want them to think we're on a witch hunt for anything. We wanted them to be involved in this kind of discussion. They came to every presentation. Most stakeholders had a place on a panel, at every panel, on every phase. The utilities we viewed as partners, they know their system better than we do. We weren't trying to run their system. We're trying to understand how we as policymakers could better utilize things and better enable technology to come to our state. We engaged with universities in Ohio, Ohio State, Ohio University, Case Western. We invited relevant professors to give us their take on things. So there's a variety of ways you can do this. And like I said, even though the legislature and legislators weren't directly involved, we definitely kept them in the loop during the whole process. So I hope that's helpful.
Great. We do have a few more questions. I guess following up on that, I know you had said there was the report itself doesn't really necessarily require action. It's really just kind of a potential roadmap, but is there any recommendations that some legislative action might be needed? For instance, if there was, if it was seen that maybe time of use metering might be something, but I mean, it really depends on, I guess, that division of power. It varies by state, how much power the PUC has to implement certain policies on its own versus what needs legislative action. But just curious as to whether you foresee maybe legislative action being needed in the future to maybe help with meeting some of the recommendations or outcomes of the Power Forward effort.
Yeah, great question. We got asked that quite a bit, and we kind of at the moment we hadn't seen any particular legislative issue with our broad statutory powers enabled us to do a lot of what we're intending, although we didn't foreclose the idea that as we move forward on this pathway, there might come a time when we do need some legislative changes in order to enable us to implement policy, and we'd have to make sure the legislature would be comfortable with that policy decision as well. I know in the policy of the state, so under our general powers, the policies that are outlined, one of the policies they've looked at adding was to pursue grid modernization in the state of Ohio, something generic to give us some broad statutory powers. I know other states have looked at different things. I guess it's like you said, it's more on a case-by-case basis, depending upon what your state statute enables your commission to do, and whether or not the legislature really wants to make a statement about a particular issue, whether it's electric vehicles or cybersecurity, or any of the number of hot button issues that they might hear from their constituents about, enabling data access, ensuring privacy. Those tend to be big ones. But like I said, for the time being, we have what we need in terms of moving forward, but other states might find that they need some other tweaks to their statutes in order to allow different technology to be incorporated.
Great. And then one more question here. This would be more for Steve, I guess. What do you see as kind of just with regards to your index? What are some of the actions that may have put some of the states in kind of higher rankings, and whether those, a number of states have passed kind of more comprehensive grid modernization policies, legislative actions, if there's any of those that kind of stand out, or if you want to kind of discuss what types of perhaps legislative actions have been taken that you could that you might want to highlight.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question as well, Glenn. Because the way we do the index, we look at 75 or 80 different factors, and no one factor scores more than 3 or 4 points. So it's not like there's one particular thing that sort of dominates. It tends to be, and I don't think this would surprise any of you, but when you see states like Illinois and California at the top, it's because they've done a lot of different things. It's not because they've done one particular thing. So the legislature in both of those states have done a lot of different bills over the last several years that have impacted the utility industry. And it's not just grid modernization. It might be a renewable portfolio standard. It might be an energy efficiency standard. It might be some combination of a jobs bill. But we try to factor all of those into that score. So it's not like there's one particular thing you can do that all of a sudden gives you a much higher score. It's really it takes time, and it takes a lot of different things going on. I would say the states that tend to be in the top 20 probably have some kind of grid modernization policy that's been passed through the legislature, and when we look at state policy, it's not just the legislature, it's also the regulators. So as Beth said, the legislature may not have passed something that's specifically grid modernization, but the regulators have, open dockets that are related to that or something. So we try to look at all of that. And so it can be driven different ways, not just by the state legislature. Glenn, was there a second part to that question, or did I answer?
No, I think that's it. And I guess with that, we're pretty much out of time. Although, if either of you had any closing comments on any specific things policymakers may want to keep in mind as they approach grid modernization, and think about like critical policy challenges that might be need to be addressed, if any are kind of standing out, that feel free to offer those.
Well, I'll say one thing real quick and then let Beth talk, which is, what continues to amaze me is how fast the technology and the market is changing. And so policies, we'd like to think policies are driving the market and driving technology, but at this point in most states, I would say the policy is lagging the technology in the markets, and that's not going to change. It's going to it's increasing. The changes that are going on that side of the page are happening even faster today than they were a couple of years ago. Beth?
Yeah, I totally agree. Grid modernization will definitely allow your state to get a little attention about innovation, because it will drive a lot of people to look at your state with a lot of innovative technology. And I guess I would encourage you to talk with a lot of variety of people if you're going to go down this pathway. Don't just talk to the companies located in your state. There are so many experts in this space. National experts that aren't pushing a certain technology through the Department of Energy. There are national associations that do studies about things. There's so many different places to go to get information, and that gives you a real overview of everything, not driving you towards a certain end game. And I think that's really important as a policymaker. It was important as a regulatory policymaker to understand the full what's going on in grid modernization, not just hearing it from people in Ohio, but incorporating what they're telling us with the grander, a larger or the larger population base across the country, and bringing in experts from those places. And I think the last thing I'll leave you with is, at the end of the day, this is about the customer. You want to make sure any kind of policy decision that impacts the customer, you want to find benefits for this innovation and technology. I mean, technology for its own sake, just because it's cool, is just because it's cool. It's not because it's helping people. And that's something we kept in mind throughout our whole process, is you have to make sure the person who's paying for it is benefiting from it. So doing that cost-benefit analysis at the end of the day. So I guess, and I'd be open to talking with any state, like I said, because we did learn a lot of things. I'd try and help you avoid some of the things that we encountered and basically make it a little easier on you. So thank you again for allowing me to speak.
Well, great. Well, and thanks to you, both Steve and Commissioner Trumbo. We really appreciate the fact that you took some time out of your busy days, I'm sure, to share your expertise and to provide us with some great information. And we also want to thank all of our attendees for participating in today's webinar, and also remind everyone that we will have a recording of the webinar along with the slides posted very shortly on the website. So again, thanks for your continued interest and support of NCSL, and have a fantastic day.